Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erika Heald, your content chat host. And today I'm back with my co-hostess with the mostest, Maureen Jann, who is joining me now through January 13th when we will be officially launching Content Foundations. I just got this hot off the press review copy today. What?
Beautiful.
So excited to look at this after our conversation, which is about brand voice, which has its own chapter in the book for good reason, because it is absolutely so essential. And it's one of the things that, believe it or not, so many organizations spend absolutely 0 hours on documenting for the people that are creating content for the organization. And then they wonder why it takes so long to do all of the things. So Maureen, thank you for joining me today to share your perspectives too about brand voice.
Absolutely. Always excited to be here. First of all, love hanging out with you. Second of all, third of all, brand voice is something I'm very deep into right now. So I get very passionate about this topic, especially for the brand that I'm working for. So I'm really excited to dive in.
So what I think is so interesting is every single brand I've worked with, even if they're a tiny little bootstrap startup, they always have brand guidelines. And you always ask them to send them over. And it has, here's our logo reversed out, here are our brand colors. Depending upon how much money they've spent on this branding, then maybe they have a brand narrative with some of the key messages. But absolutely none of them ever have a section that helps people creating content actually understand how to take that brand voice and make it come to life in the way that you're creating content.
Absolutely. That is a consistent theme for me as well. Sometimes they'll show you how not to use their logo before you'll get the tone and voice. So it is a great point. But I would say, like, is that brand guideline really the place for the tone and voice? That's another question and another debate.
Oh, no, definitely not.
Yeah.
But the point being that you think, you put in, your brand guidelines and they're like, here you go. This is everything everybody needs to know about our brand. It's like, but it's not. That is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yep. Yeah. I know for me, when I got to my job, the first thing I did was make a brand and tone voice because, well, I work in the IT space, and how do you talk to IT people in a way that actually resonates with them? It's tricky. And so you had to start with something and then use it and evolve. So I'm really, like I said, this is something that's core to my world right now.
Well, to me, the big issue with the voice and tone is you don't want to sound like all your competitors, and you don't want to sound like a bland, generic, what we used to call corporate voice, which it just makes me get the ick to even say that phrase to you. But, back in the early days of my career, I do recall having reviewers say, oh, this needs to sound more corporate. And you hear that and you just go, oh, you mean take all the personality out of it. But thankfully, I don't get that kind of feedback anymore from the kinds of organizations I'm working with because I won't create content if they don't have a brand voice already documented. I just won't, because I'm not going to just read a few things and try to guess. I'm not ever going to do that. Even if they're like not open to doing a full workshop to, get into it hands-on using our human brains, at a minimum, I will go ahead and I will use some AI prompts that I've built and go out there and look at their existing content and put together, AI's best guess at what their brand voice is and get them to sign off on it to let me know I'm on the right track, because it's painful and horrible to try to create content without a brand voice. That's when you get something back and it's all redlined and you feel bad about it. Like, let's not do that. That's so avoidable.
Absolutely. I think establishing a baseline with your organization or at your organization is key. I back to like the whole generic voice thing, like the reality behind the whole generic voice thing is that it is risky. It feels risky, like it's inherently feels risky to have a distinct point of view. But the reality is equally risky not to have one, right? Because if we sound like everybody else, then you're going to sound like everybody else, and there's no way to differentiate you. So like the brand voice is one of the very key ways to make sure that you stand out in the market in a way that's meaningful. I have an example about this, which I'm doing this month because it's the holidays, right? And you could just do a generic holiday campaign, right? But I decided to do
I mean, like Coca-Cola's generic AI holiday campaign?
Oh, that was so bad. Oh my gosh, they're so renowned for their good holiday stuff. Like that was such a letdown. I know for so many people, I know there are a lot of Coca-Cola fan people out there. So ooh, yeah. So, but what we decided to do, or what I decided to do, because I was left alone with my own devices and a way to make some animated social media campaigns, is every single one is almost like a tongue-in-cheek, like enjoy it now, because after the new year, when everybody logs in on January 5th, it's going to suck for you. Is sort of like the overarching theme. I made a Christmas tree out of like indicator lights that you would see on an IT dashboard, like just funny, engaging things that like say, I get you, we get you, we understand you, you know, and I think if you were to look at us, those moments compared to like what you would see in other IT organizations, that would be potentially considered risky. And if I had more checks and balances and people didn't trust me, I may not have been able to do that. So there's some interesting points about autonomy and risk, and being able to really capture like where your customer is coming from, really understanding them well in a way that I just don't think we as a rule get it to do as content people very often. So
I'm so interested because I feel like people think, oh, you know, your brand voice is just sort of this fluffy brand marketing thing, and you know, it doesn't really matter and it's not really that helpful. But really it helps you attract the right people, because your brand voice is, you know, part of your branding in that it's aware of who you're trying to talk to and what they need from you, what your content is going to deliver. All of those elements are actually baked into your brand voice. It's not just, you know, like playing paper dolls, which frankly, a lot of the brand guides are just how you play paper dolls with the brand. And, you know, it's helpful because obviously graphic designers do need to know the codes for getting your colors right and all of that. But your brand is about so much more than just what colors to use and what your font is.
Absolutely. I think this is where emotional intelligence comes into it too. When you speak to one person versus another person about what you do, if you're at a cocktail party and you're just generally telling somebody what you do, they're not going to understand the nuance. But when you're talking directly to the customer and the people that you want to have, you want them to understand what you do implicitly without mistaking or misunderstanding you. You have to be able to capture their attention and connect with them in an emotional, like a social emotional way before they can even hear you. And so there is, I think, the risk of not getting the brand voice right is high, right? If you sound generic and you sound, I hate the word authentic because we have as marketers beaten it to death, but inauthentic, if you sound like you are play acting or paper dolling, you know, the message to fit one audience versus another, people are going to write you off, especially if you have a highly skeptical audience. So
you're competing on price, like you're a commodity, and you don't want to be one of those brands that has, you know, 20 different brands on Amazon, all of which are just tweaked a tiny bit to try to appeal to a different, you know, consumer archetype, but are really the exact same products. Like maybe, I mean, if that's what you want to do, then fine. You know, don't take any time and bother to define your brand voice. But for the rest of us, and for B2B, which we have long buying cycles, we have big ticket items, you do need to differentiate yourself from your competition. And it's not just because you're green and they're blue. That is not differentiating.
No. I mean, really, if you do it right, this is kind of one of the few things that your competitors can't copy, because your voice should be an aggregate or a conglomeration of the DNA of your organization, right? That is such an opportunity to really make you stand out.
So when it comes to documenting your brand voice, you know, as we alluded to, it doesn't really, the right place for all of your brand voice documentation is certainly not in the brand guidelines. But I think the one thing that can go in your brand guide, and then you can link out to more information, is you can link out to that. I mean, you can include that basic brand voice definition chart where you have the brand voice attribute, that super short definition of what that actually means in your organization, and some really simple do's and don'ts. You absolutely should not try to cram in, that narrative voice description and all the examples of what, good and bad examples, like all that stuff. That would be way overkill for your brand guide. But I think you can have just that, minimum viable brand voice chart, which frankly is going to be the thing that people can internalize and memorize, and that you can of course use with any of your AI tools. It's so important, because if without it, then you end up with confusion. And I always give the example of, I've worked multiple places where they've wanted to have irreverent as a brand voice attribute. And I've worked exactly one place that did it well. And that was a magazine, actually, back when I was in college. They did that really well. But that's also because the editor went in and edited everything so that it was as irreverent as he wanted it to be. That is not scalable. And that's something that was barely something that he could do as the editor of a monthly magazine. And it's definitely not something that you can do as a content person, with all sorts of people creating content throughout your organization.
I think that actually goes to a good point, though. It's okay to have people who embody, if you're looking at the brand voice and tone as like a scale, you can have people more on this side of the more tech scale in my case, or this side of more the business challenge scale. And with the approaches can also be that way. If you have a selection of attributes, like you can also do that kind of a scale where I'm a little more on the cheeky side versus our engineer is a little more on the techie, like no nonsense side, so having a mix of those people, I think, actually shows that there are a variety of voices that are coming out from your brand. And I think that builds credibility largely because you're seeing that from different perspectives. As long as the different perspectives are clearly marked. I think this is where a lot of brands get into trouble too, because we end up having everybody be from the brand and it sounds a little different every time, versus if you have individual authors on the blog articles, not only does this help with SEO and a bunch of other stuff and actually establishing your folks as thought leaders, but it also creates some transparency, or just a transparency to your organization and why there is a variance and why there's variability between article to article.
I will say, though, you absolutely have to have everybody still agree on that definition for what the word means, because going back to irreverent, if you don't, and you say that there can be the leeway for people to interpret things, that's how you end up with one person on social media being like Wendy's and the other person being like a little cheeky and off the cuff. And that is too disparate. So you do need to have some guardrails. And that, to me, is what a solid brand voice chart can do, is it gives those really helpful guardrails. So that way, irreverent means that you're not using obvious examples and you're just being a little tongue in cheek, maybe the occasional innuendo, but that you're not going full on snark and making people feel bad, because, there are just too many of these words that mean different things to different people.
I think this actually speaks really nicely to the governance that you put around the brand voice documents that you put together, because I know that they do a really nice job of defining what that looks like and how that gets executed. And I would love to talk a little bit more about that.
Totally. But first, I wanted to ask what you usually are including in yours, because I know you've just gone through this exercise. So I'd love to hear what goes into your voice guide.
I brought it up because I couldn't remember, because it was like a couple of months ago. I have my GPT trained, so I don't generally refer back to the deck very often, but I pulled it up just so I had it here for reference. So for this brand guide, I wanted to tell a little bit of a story and a narrative. So I always and I think this is actually just probably good practice, is like, who are we talking to and what do they care about? You know what I mean? Like, just have an overarching, like, we all agree that this is who they are, this is where they work, and this is what they care about, right? And so that's a slide that I put together. And then also, like, there's the perspectives or the angle in which this particular ICP or your particular ICP actually needs, right? So they need a certain approach, or else they won't hear what you have to say. For instance, ours is like relate, don't pitch, right? Connect, be human, validate their reality, these kinds of rules, so that you have a perspective that you can come at this with that's very strong. Like, and when you're reading through somebody else's copy, you can say something like, you know, this looks robotic. We want to make sure this sounds like a human being wrote it, you know. And then the other thing is, this looks like we're trying to pitch, and we can't pitch. We need to show them we understand what's happening to them. You know, we need them to, we need to say, here's what's happening, but here's some new information about that situation. So that's a really big one too. So just some perspectives that we come at to make sure that we have like some check boxes that we need to use to read through it. So we call that perspectives that resonate. And
it's really about the humanity, because everything I'm hearing you talk about is really helping folks bring that human element into what they're creating, not having that bland. You know, nobody wants corporate grays. Nobody wants the cloud white or whatever the Pantone color the year is. Nobody wants that.
No, they don't. The gray goo of AI nonsense. We're not interested, right? Another thing that was really important for our brand voice was just making sure that we identified that third-party validation is key for every statement we make, or you know, every big idea, because the reality is our audience is very skeptical. It really struggles with trusting brands because honestly, like, they've been burned too many times, or a variety of different options or realities. And so we called out the role of third-party validation in our work. So I know that none of this sounds specifically brand voicey, but I think there's kind of the support, the foundation pieces before we actually get to like the brand voice itself. So,
well, what's funny is, to me, I immediately thought when you said that, I'm like, oh, so you have expert as one of your brand voice attributes, because, you know, having
it is. Yes.
And you're wondering how I knew that. And it's literally because you had the, you know, importance of the third party, the third party sources. And so for me, you know, I have always an example I like to give, that if you're trying to be an expert, you know, you have to back up all your statements with facts or experiences. You can't just make statements. You've got to cite those sources, and they can't be decades old sources, and they can't be those third party sources. Like, you have to be linking to third party to you, yes, but not a source that's the like top 25 marketing statistics for 2026. They don't ever link to any sources, because they're the made up stats that everybody has been using, all collected in one place. It's like, if you can't say where the data came from and link to that proprietary source, you know, you're not being an expert. You're being somebody who used Claude to get a bunch of, you know, maybe stats. And I like Claude. Claude is fantastic, but you need to use it and tell it that you want first party data, that you want it to take you to the originating source to cite.
Yeah. And the other tricky part is, like, if you're dealing with like what's the word I'm looking for? You know, the like Forrester and those types. Analysts. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. If we're dealing with analysts, then we have the additional problem of original research from the analysts being sponsored by companies, and then being sent to a company's website. So that's another tricky piece, I think, that we have also had to navigate a bit of. But you're right. I think expert is a very good way to talk about the brand. We also have confident, clear, empathetic, speaks like a peer, those types of things to help us really define it. And then I show how that tone works in action, right? So here's a do, here's a don't, here's what here's what this might sound like in an email versus what this might sound like in a social media post versus a white paper paragraph. So just really expanding out and putting this to work for people so they can see how it performs in different contexts, I think is a big piece of what we do.
I love that, because that's the, you know, creating that brand voice guide that shows people how to actually bring that documentation to life. And,
exactly.
You know, you've got to do that. You got to show them what good looks like, and, you know, and why you're, you know, it helps make it real. And then, when you point to those examples of, and here's an example of a brand doing the opposite of this, then they can actually see it and go, oh, I get why this seems sketchy. Somebody who has, a piece of content that opens with a bunch of unsourced data at the top saying, oh, we all know that this, and this is true. And it's like, no, we don't, because you didn't link to any of those sources for those stats that you just made up.
Right. It's so bad. The other thing I think that is surprisingly important that I think is something we traditionally haven't done as marketers is because we haven't needed it, as I also provide in the brand and voice document an AI prompt for other people to take their raw content and have it edit on their behalf using the brand voice attributes that we think are important. And so that has been very useful for people who are generating their own content within the organization, because I'm not leaving them hanging. It's not my opinion. You know what I mean? This is them doing their work, and then I get it, and I get to take a final read through it and just make sure that it aligns. But they already have all the tools they need to do the work without adding a ton to their workload, which is so cool. So,
in addition to giving them that prompt, do you also give them the URL so that they can use your trained GPT?
I have not figured that out yet, to be quite honest.
I will help you with that.
Thank you. I will take you up on that. We can be very good at many, many things, but the reality is digging into the ever winding road of AI capability is like almost a full-time job, in my opinion.
And it's so exciting. It's been really fun for me to see how the client work I've been talking to folks about has just radically shifted over the past 18 months, because now, I'm coming in, I'm helping people understand, what kind of governance they need to have in place, and then building them tools that everyone across the organization can use. So that way you have that brand consistency, because that's the biggest issue is, across so many different websites, you'll have the situation where you are in the middle of a page and you can tell where somebody inserted an update and that it was a different person than who wrote it originally, because it just sounds weird. And you're like, what happened in the middle of this content I'm reading? And you don't want to have that happen, even though you obviously will 100% have people updating your best content who weren't the ones who wrote it. But when you have a strong brand voice, it means that you can have lots of different writers and even have their own kind of variation and riffs on things, but it can still have that same reflection of, hey, this did come from the same company.
Yep. I do love that idea. I think I've really struggled with creating tools across an organization because I think the quality of some of the tools that are inherent in some of the suites that are available to me within the corporation are not as good as some of the other tools. And so I've been hesitant to really push on it because I couldn't guarantee quality. And that has been a blocker for me. So it's cool to hear that you've had some success with that. And I would love, that could be a whole fun conversation all on its own.
Well, it's fun. I'm going to be doing a more hands-on workshop for marketing profs in February that is about showing people, here's how you go in and, build out your instructions for creating a custom gem or a GPT for a variety of marketing tasks. So that way you are reflecting your own internal templates, way of doing things, etc. So, it's so great if people have access to either of those, but I know in a lot of organizations, they have Copilot, and I've definitely heard from folks that Copilot has been a lot more challenging to use and has been a lot harder to to do the same thing that has been made really easy to do in ChatGPT and within Google's AI suite.
Their Gemini, yeah.
And then, then there are all the tools that are purpose-built for marketing, which sort of market themselves as making it foolproof to go in and to, use the tool to generate on-brand content. But I'll tell you, what's been frustrating to me is half of the tools ask you to do something silly like paste in 500 words of copy, and that way we will tell you what your brand voice is, which no way, that is absolutely not going to work. Or others that make you laboriously recreate your like brand voice and style guide entry by entry, line by line in their tool. I'm like, and that just blows my mind, because you absolutely need at a minimum to be able to upload your own documentation and call back to it. But the only tool I've used that lets you do that was copy.ai. And, they let you do that, but then it means you have more complexity in the way that you're using it, because you can't just use some of the workflows off the shelf, because you need to then add in those callbacks of be sure to apply my style document and all of this. So there, a lot of these tools that are supposed to be really easy off the shelf, to me, aren't. They're not there yet.
I right when AI started about 2 years ago, like the big AI push started, I did try all the marketing tools, all the writing tools, and I was so disappointed and so frustrated by the time we got done. And I was like, I need this to do more than it does. And I need to do it on my terms. I need to, just having it be only writing or only proofreading, or, just like these. I think they're great for people who are probably not lifetime marketers, like you and me. We've been doing this since, we were knee high to a grasshopper,
Yeah, I did my first newsletter when I was in elementary school. I had pen pals and I made a newsletter.
I understand. I was writing posters and marketing copy for my babysitting business when I was in 5th grade. So I hear you. Like, this has been our whole lives. Like, don't try to restrict me with words. Yeah, right. That's what I mean. Like, we need a little more room. And so, like, I'm sure that those tools are great for somebody, maybe early marketers, maybe companies with no marketer at all. Maybe those are great for them, but that's just not who we are and not where we need to be, and not how we serve our clients or our organization. So the tool thing is still a bit of a trick, I think. I think there's still some obstacles to being able to use all these AI tools across the board for tone effectively. So the fact that you found some good systems is honestly kind of a miracle. Good on you.
It's just been trial and error and work and replication.
Sure.
Like anything.
I know, but it's hard. It's hard, and I don't want you to sell yourself short. You know what I mean? So,
but it's also because I'm selfish in that I don't want to spend my time on low value work. There's just, I shouldn't review everything that every person ever creates in a client organization or in my own organization. That's a waste of everyone's time. You need to 100%. Yes, you want people to make sure that the AI is not ruining things for you, but you absolutely need to let AI and other humans create content. You can't create everything yourself. And you can't edit everything and polish everything yourself either. You've got to be able to let go of those reins, just because there's no way that your organization creates so little content that you could possibly look at everything. So you have to have systems in place to support that consistency, because your brand trust comes from that consistency of voice, that they know what they can expect from you. Because if something feels really off, people will call you out for it. And frequently where you see that happen is on social. Something will just feel really off that the brand put out there. And then you'll hear about it on social loudly and frequently until you address it.
Yeah. And rightfully so. Like, good, call us out, make us do better. I think we have a responsibility as publishers to do better. So I don't think that's crazy. So what about you and your tone voice guide? What am I missing that you would usually put in?
I mean, the big thing is that, for every time that I create these kinds of things, I just always start off with that dead simple brand voice chart, because I think there are people who will dig in and read everything, but there are a bunch of folks who absolutely are not going to read the narrative. And so I try to make it really simple. Like for expert, my dues are, use industry terminology, backup statements with facts or experiences, cite your sources, and share practical advice based on your experience. And the don'ts are, don't make unfounded claims, don't use unnecessary jargon, don't include acronyms without first explaining and defining them, don't use those old outdated sources. So just being really practical and prescriptive so that people understand exactly what I mean, but even more importantly, that then people can copy and paste that with their prompts into AI tools that they're using. So that way the AI understands what we mean. Because, again, you don't want to just have it be close. You want it to be pretty darn close if you can. So I really like to do all of that. And then what goes into the larger guide really depends on the organization. Because, if it's a bigger organization and depending upon who the people are that are needing the help, then you might need to have things like having open office hours where you can talk to people about the editorial process, or where you give coaching, especially if you're involved with executive thought leadership. Having that kind of thing on the calendar where they know that they can get a hold of you and ask you their questions means that they're going to be a lot more likely to adopt all of the tools that you've put in place for them.
That's so true. The other thing that came up for me is when we were talking about, as we've talked about establishing the brand voice, how do you deal with it as the brand voice evolves? Because it inevitably changes, right? Because you learn, you grow, you learn and grow and move on.
I edit it all the time, and we talk about it in editorial meetings, not in like the weekly kinds of meetings you might be having with the what are we doing, where stuff at, but in those bigger editorial meetings, like the quarterly ones, that's where you get feedback from people about things that are or aren't working, or when things change. We have a client right now who actually just made a really large change from a voice standpoint, as far as just, changing some terminology that they're using that 100% affects the brand voice. And so then, we're updating the style guide and the voice chart, and we're going to be coming back. And, we actually, because of that, we're coming back with some recommendations for some places where maybe they shouldn't make the change, because in order to stay on brand, making that change could actually have some issues that they didn't think about, because the change was made without talking to all members of the team.
That makes sense. As I was rolling out the first version of our brand and tone, or voice and tone guide, I found that it was starting to sound like generic corporate goo. And that just didn't sit right with me. Not me, like me as a human being, because that's just not. You're right to brand voice. I mean, nobody does it better than Ann Handley. So you could just put her on the map for like how to do things right when it comes to writing for your brand and living that voice. But a couple of years ago, I went to a marketing prof's. I went to a marketing prof's event, and she was like, even your button copy should reflect your voice. And it took me some time to sort of percolate that and take that in. But as my brand voice is maturing, and as I'm leading that charge, it's surprising how often humor is starting to emerge for us. Like, it's not funny. Like, IT is not funny. It's just not. But man, sometimes it's easier to laugh at your job than it is to cry, right? And I think that there's some real value in being able to connect with people and empathize with them, I guess, on that level. And so that's how I've sort of interpreted empathy and sort of rolled that out. So, but having this conversation is making me realize I need to update my brand guideline, because I actually have changed it.
Right? I mean, and I think every year, as you're looking at, what worked, what didn't work, it's a very good time to be updating your personal brand standards, because things do evolve over the course of the year. What I love about Ann Handley, and, obviously she has such the witty, recognizable, standout voice, but her whole organization has a really remarkable human voice, despite being, a group that's all about B2B marketing. Everyone within the organization sounds like themselves, but it all still, you can tell you're getting out an email from marketing profs, and it doesn't sound like people are trying to copy Ann, because that would be a mistake. No one should try to copy Ann. Everyone's developed their own voice, but within this feeling that, there is the shared like freshness, and we get you, and treating you like family, like all of these kinds of brand attributes come across with everybody's content. just their voice still has their own little nuances and things that make it come from them, but it still does ladder up. And so I think they're a really good use case when you hear people say, oh, well, we can't possibly have one defined brand voice because our CEO needs to sound different than our CMO versus, you know, the way that our chatbot on the website is talking to people. Like, nope, you can have brand attributes the same way that you have different brand values for each person in your organization. I sure hope not. That would be really silly.
Super silly. And like, why wouldn't you? I love the word empathy as being a brand attribute because it can be interpreted in so many ways by so many different people, but still achieve the same outcome, right? The empathy, it means that you can connect with somebody and understand their feeling, right? Like, so then if you're doing it from a CMO's perspective versus a COO versus a chatbot versus like a sales rep, like you're all rowing in the same direction. I want to understand my customer. I want my customer to know that I understand them. It doesn't matter who you are. All of that still needs to be accomplished, and it can be done in your way, but still with that goal in mind.
You know, what's funny is recently I was working with somebody who isn't used to the kinds of templates that I create. And they were asking me for something. I was like, why are they asking me for that? And then I realized it's because in the version of the document we gave them, we hadn't deleted our template. So in the thing they're looking for, our template was still there. And so they were seeing our example from our template and trying to understand, oh, well, where's the file that goes with this? And that just made me think through like, oh my gosh, that is how, you know, how rare it is for people to be putting together templates that actually show, here's how the voice shows up. Here's how you can see an example of the word count. Here's the formatting for how we title things, etc. It happens so rarely that people, even if you have it in a different color and you have, you know, the word example or EX or have it in brackets, that still, it happens so rarely that people don't necessarily recognize it. But they should, every time you have a template, you know, you need to have a clean version of the template, sure, that people can use, but you need to have that version of it either filled out or with the example right there in front of them so that they can see, here's what I need to do here. Because when you don't do that, that's when you get people, you know, people can't adhere to something that they can't even understand or imagine what it might be. You know, like, you know, we don't, I don't ask the Content Chat Recap Pro to reimagine what the intro is like for every one of the recaps. We give it the example. It's in the template of this is how you do, this is the recipe for the introduction. And, you know, you can do those same kinds of things within your templates to make sure that things are on brand and that they reflect your voice.
So when you talk about templates, I immediately go to like design templates because that's like, I'm also a generalist, right? I'm not just a content person, although content's a huge part of my job. I think about like social media templates that are all brand appropriate. And I think about setting up Canva, and I think about all these different types of templates that
you can even do it in those. 100%. You can have that, you know, instead of having it be lorem ipsum dolor, you can have your brand template be real. It can be actual words that you would use, or you can have it be words that are describing what it is. It's hard to do that, to have that kind of, you know, ability to really be concise in those kinds of situations. But if you can, that way you're showing and telling them at the same time how to use the template so they're not guessing. And that is just magical when you can make that happen.
That's a gift, honestly. Like, it's a gift for me. Like if I was coming to a gig, like especially as a contractor before I was actually full-time, what a gift to walk into an organization and have like actual infrastructure so that way you can be successful more quickly. Right? Or a new employee. That's another example of when like you could walk in and be like, oh, I know exactly what I need to do. The onboarding time reduces to almost nothing if they know what they're looking at.
Well, it's just like having really good content briefs. Brief. So many people, you know, have a content brief that maybe it has like 5 questions and some just big blank spots. That does not help me if I'm new to an organization. Content brief needs to have, don't ask me who the audience for this is. Give me things to pick from. Give me a pull down, give me a checklist, something.
Right.
But it's funny because my most hated of all time content briefs, creative briefs rather, was one that just was like that. It was just open-ended. And at the time, I'm like, I don't know any of the answers to these questions. My division doesn't have a built-out messaging document that answers all of these questions. So you just would end up putting some baloney in there, and then somebody would, call you up and want to fight with you about what you put in it. And I'm like, I didn't want to fill out your dumb form in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that if you're using your brand voice well, like a lot of this stuff actually can be built into a creative brief in a way that's really it's point and click, right? Because you can say like what are the main parts of this, what are the main voice attributes you want to feature into this piece. You want it to be, let's say you give a list of all of them, and you can click your top 1, 2, or 3 attributes that you want to hone in on from a brand voice perspective. Awesome. If you're talking about like identifying the big key messages and how you talk about those messages, and then you use that as a way to choose from the, you can choose that this one rolls up to this big message, and here's the sub points you want to include. Like, what an incredible way to be so clear. You have this ability to take these infrastructure pieces like a voice and brand tone and to roll it out across an organization to make sure that it is literally crystal clear what you're trying to accomplish, why you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to accomplish it for. I mean, who doesn't want that level of granularity and sharpness and clarity and ease of rolling
and just have it embedded in their workflows, embedded in the tools they're using, embedded in the form they're filling out or their template, so they're not having to go, oh, what was their 4th brand voice trait? I don't remember. How does it affect what I'm doing here?
Yeah.
That's silly.
I agree with you. Absolutely. And I think that there's probably a downfall to him building that into creative briefs, though, as well as like, because organizations change so frequently through the year, you have to change all those things, and that sort of renders all of the older creative briefs slightly out of date. And so you end up running into this like little seesaw action. You're like, should I go fix that? Should I go retroactively? I mean, obviously,
never edit a brief that's already been submitted, but 100% always edit your template. And that's why you have to make sure that you tell people, don't copy an old brief. Do not ever do that, that you need to always start from the latest version, because you're so right. Things do change. Yeah. And so you have to make sure that you build that into the way that they organize things and use things. Like, a great example is, having people use a blog template that actually is embedded in your CMS. So they can use the Word document or the Google document to do their prep work before they go in there. But you can have somebody draft within a really well-structured template that asks them for all of the things and has the word count that it won't let them type more than. And that feels kind of mean. But on the flip side, if you have those kinds of limitations because you need to make sure that you're not having headlines that are too long, or that you're everything in your events database is formatted a specific way, you can literally build those input visuals in your CMS so that the person putting it in is doing things the way that you need them to do also.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
Those situations, then it doesn't matter if you've updated the template, because you probably updated it there first. I hope.
Yeah, and some of the templates are dynamic, right? And that makes things easier too, because you just have a one single source of truth. This is the creative brief link. You fill out this form, you submit this form. This is now the creative brief that you built. And exactly. That I've had really good luck with that, especially when I was at my agency and we needed to organize things very specifically. We even had a drop down for which client it went to, and it would port itself into a little folder like a fancy magical carpet ride. It was very cool.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think we would be reticent, though, or remiss rather, if we did not talk about some of the challenges in bigger companies around brand voice. Because I think we've all been in these situations where, you can have that defined brand voice, but then you have an executive that always wants to rewrite things to sound more like them, even if it means blowing up the brand. Or in highly regulated industries, you can end up in situations where there's so much of the flavor text can get edited out. So I'd love to hear, some of your tips for, how to deal with those people in your organization that just want to keep rewriting things to make it sound different. Or because they've heard that something like the M dash is a sign that something was generated by AI, which it is not.
I legitimately have had this conversation recently. Oh, that's so funny. I think, in my current org, it's very easy for everything to sound generic and technical, and that is probably everybody's bent. And I don't have a ton of people writing in my org, but I know that in my past experiences, there is definitely that fine line. I think with thought leadership, with like executives, they should, the information they are sharing, especially if their name is attached to it, it should sound like them. And there needs to be a compromise, right? You maybe even more so, you already predefine what their brand and their voice is and how it rolls up to the larger brand. So that way you can still live within the brand voice guide, like ecosystem, and then I think that reduces the friction there because you've already established, I understand that I'm a CEO at this org. These are the things that are important for me to get across about my voice and my tone. Okay, great. Let's marry that with the brand. So that way you sound like you, but you also still sound like the CEO of this company. I think if you do some of that legwork, you're going to win long term because you already have an agreement and even better documented, obviously. Governance your face off, and make sure that they have, they agree that you have like it in writing. Yes, I agree. This is my brand voice. I have done this and still had this fail. So, sometimes you win some, sometimes you don't. But ultimately,
what's cool though, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just, when you're talking, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is totally what I've done in those environments where I've had legal and compliance,
Yes.
issues too. We always talk about, I've bribed a lot of people with cookies in my in-house
bribery.
I'm a baker. All right. This is what happens. But the thing is then I also, while they're eating the cookies, put out the idea of, hey, so, some feedback I've gotten, for example, is we're supposed to be trustworthy and on the side of the small investor, but I'm doing inserts that go into people's statements where the copy is a quarter of the amount of text of the disclosures. That doesn't feel very on brand for me. And, starting from those kinds of conversations and saying, hey, what I would love to do is figure out how we can minimize, we obviously there's going to be disclosures we have to do. There are things we need to do from a compliance standpoint, but how can we not have so much of that copy? And do we have any leeway with what some of the copy says? And it was interesting because my compliance partners had never had someone from marketing come to them and say, hey, can I take a stab at rewriting some of this compliance copy and see if we can get legal to approve it? Nobody had ever asked to do that because usually people go, compliance, and nobody wants to talk. No offense, legal. Nobody wants to talk to legal. That's like just really on everybody's afraid of to-do list.
Yeah, agreed.
So I created what I called friendly disclaimers. I went in and I tried to write things in plain English, as little bit of plain English as possible. Mm-hmm. And I also tried to figure out what are some things that trigger having to do some of these really onerous disclaimers so that way I never have to use them. And some of it's just really, easy, like words that you should never use. Like don't ever use the word options if you're a financial services company, unless you're talking about trading stock options. Take that word and erase it from your vocabulary because you're going to it's going to be a problem. It's going to trigger being kicked back from legal, but just understand what for your organization and industry, what are the things that will absolutely trigger having to do a bunch of disclosures, like talking about something and casually mentioning a company that, you are in the midst of acquiring, that's going to trigger a bunch of disclosure. Like just helping people understand what they can do to avoid those triggers. Because again, you don't want those things that are required or, mandatory to detract from your brand voice. Because again, how trustworthy do you feel about a company? How trustworthy do you feel they are when there's so much fine print for just a few words? It doesn't work.
I also think this shines a giant spotlight on the fact that marketing needs context. We need context about what's happening in the organization. We need context about the legal implications. We need context so we can guide people and we can help them understand what the do and do nots are, especially in industries like you're talking about, the highly regulated ones. I am grateful that I have not in my career had to work exclusively for a very highly regulated industry, which means that I have had a lot of freedom and a lot of room to hang myself, but I have had friends who've worked in financial services oftentimes and the healthcare industry as well. And it is a minefield. And I think without that context and without those strong guidelines and without and actively addressing things like legal, like you're talking about, you sort of leave your brand up for interpretation by prospects. And that's not really where you want to be. And you can really get ahead of it. And I mean, I think there's other industries or other scenarios where this also makes sense. And so I've run into some of those, but getting ahead of it is always the right idea, especially 100%. When it's content and it comes to writing. So
we're almost out of time, but I have to say, I recently helped a large fintech organization rewrite their website. And because we did a really good job of, defining their brand voice and figuring out what are the actual proof points that prove those messages that we want to put out there, it meant that the very few times that legal came back and questioned whether or not we could say certain things that we said, we were able to point to an actual quantifiable proof point that made it valid. I think there were maybe a couple, like literally a couple of things that we had to change that we couldn't get legal to agree with what we're doing. And that was literally because we had done such a good job of understanding how we wanted to come across and what all of our proof points were for making that case before we wrote anything. And those were the most beautiful creative briefs I've seen in my life because they were full of context, all of this context to help me understand what I was writing about. So frequently, they would be really long briefs for very brief copy, but you need that in order to get something that's going to be amazing and sound like the brand, even if you're having an external person who's not an employee creating that content.
I think a big takeaway here is know the organization well enough to understand what you serve, what you provide, what the limitations, what the restrictions are, where you need to have, and just general context about what's happening in your organization. And then you have on the other side, I'm imagining a Venn diagram right now. That's what I'm doing with my hands. It's imaginary. But the other one I think is understanding your customers so well that they know that how they want to be spoken to and how to connect with them as human beings, even regardless of what industry you're in. What do they need to do their jobs better? How can you help them? How do they receive information best? And then that's where the brand and tone guide kind of comes in. And that's the middle of the Venn diagram. It's all the beauty of everything you know about your org and everything you know about your customer put into this one package that helps you speak about what you do to the people it matters to most.
Totally. And it just, it boils it down to how you want to show up for them. Yep. And you've got to have that in writing. You've got to have that documented, and you've got to socialize it with everybody, because if not, you're going to just be creating mediocre content, and mediocre content is not going to help your business grow or even maintain.
No, documentation, it's a thing. It's key.
It's a good thing. Sorry, I had to. And with that, we are at the end of our content chat for today. There's so much more. We could literally talk for 4 hours about brand voice. We're not going to, but we could. And there is more about brand voice here in my shiny book. I'm so excited. I get to go read this afternoon, launching in January. But we'll be back next week for our final. No, we have 2 more. No, next week will be our final content chat for the year. This year, having Thanksgiving so late has been very confusing for me. But that'll be our final content chat of the year. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next week. And thank you so much, Maureen, for being my partner in crime on this.
Always fun. I always learn something new.
Same. Bye, everybody.